I'm James Lawler, and this is Climate Now. We have a very exciting announcement to make at the top of our show today, which is that we are beginning a partnership with the Livermore Lab Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that supports science, technological innovation, and fundamental research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Here with me today at the top of this episode are Sally Allen, who is the Executive Director of the Livermore Lab Foundation, and Roger Ames, who is the Energy Program Chief Scientist in E-Program, which conducts government and private sector research in clean energy technology. Roger also leads the Carbon Initiative at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which aims to understand, develop, and implement technologies for the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so-called negative emissions technologies, which we've covered before on this program. Sally, would you give us an introduction to the Livermore Lab Foundation?
Livermore is really about solving large, complex problems, tackling some of the biggest issues of our day, of course, climate being one of them. And to solve big issues, you really need to engage a broad cross-section of stakeholders in that. And we see the foundation's role as being helpful in facilitating those partnerships and enabling some of them.
Roger, I wonder if you could tell us about what you sort of drew you to facilitate this relationship between the foundation and Climate Now.
One of the things that the lab is very engaged in today is trying to understand how to clean up the atmosphere, how to remove CO2 from the air. And that's much more than a technical challenge. That's also an educational issue. It's an outreach issue. It's a building partnerships and networks issue. And so working with the foundation is a terrific way for us to approach this from more than just a technical angle.
In terms of the partnership with Climate Now, and obviously the approach that you all take to being, science-driven and easy to understand, accessible information about climate solutions, we see this as a real win-win for us, both to keep climate at the forefront of these conversations nationally and also to make that science more accessible to more audiences.
We are especially excited to be partnering with the Livermore Lab Foundation because it will enable us to expand our work to bring well-researched, in-depth content to our audience and give us access to some of the leading scientists in the space. Today, I'm speaking with environmental economist Dr. Sheila Olmsted about the economics of carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, or CCUS. Now, this is not our first episode on CCUS. Earlier, we learned about the origin and state-of-the-art of carbon capture technology from a pioneer in the field, Dr. Howard Herzog of MIT. And in another episode, Dr. Julio Friedman of Columbia University explained to us why carbon capture and storage needs to be a key component of our global decarbonization strategy. But we wanted to come back to this topic because despite learning that carbon capture is a key part of most US and global models for reaching net zero, and despite there already being government policies in place in many countries to encourage or facilitate carbon capture, there are fewer than 30 commercially operating carbon capture facilities in the entire world, and they are capturing only about 0.1% of the CO2 equivalent emissions from the world's energy and industrial sectors. We wanted to understand why the adoption of CCUS technology has been so sluggish and how to speed it up. So we reached out to Dr. Olmsted, who was recently awarded a large research grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to explore exactly this question. Dr. Olmsted is a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and she is the former White House senior economist for energy and the environment on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Dr. Olmsted, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Pleased to be here.
Perhaps we could start by introducing to our audience what an environmental economist does. That is, what kinds of questions do you answer in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do research on lots of different topics, most of them having to do with water or energy management in some way, and also a lot of intersections with regulations and statistical estimation of the impacts of various environmental policies on important outcomes, particularly with respect to carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which I know is the topic that we're talking about today. I'm the principal investigator on a project that I have wonderful collaborators both here at the University of Texas and also at the University of Wyoming, where we're looking at the possibilities for and constraints on the scaling up of this important set of technologies, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, especially with respect to industrial sources of emissions. So things like refineries, steel plants, cement plants, and so on.
Terrific. And we're going to dive into that fascinating work in this conversation. Before we do, I wonder if you could set the table for us a little bit and define carbon capture, utilization, and storage. What exactly is that?
Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS, which is the common acronym, describes a set of technologies that capture CO2, the major greenhouse gas that's warming the global climate, from sources like power plants or industrial sources like those I named earlier, refineries, steel plants, and so on, and either reuses it or stores it in deep geological formations. And the storage spots can be things like old oil and gas wells or saline aquifers and so on. So what you need is a sort of secure place where the CO2 is unlikely to reemerge. And in doing that, right, the firms capture the CO2 before it's able to enter the atmosphere and cause any climate damages. And this is an important set of technologies, especially with respect to the industrial sector, which is responsible for about 23%, so close to a quarter of US greenhouse gas emissions today, and a slightly larger share of greenhouse gas emissions globally.
And why have you made that a particular focus of your work, given your, the broad range of topics that you've engaged with?
Yeah, how did it come about? So two of my colleagues here at UT, Ben Leibowitz, who's in our operations research department in the School of Engineering at UT, and Andrew Waxman, who like me is an environmental economist at the policy school, started working on a project a couple of years ago. This is pre-pandemic, but not too much pre-pandemic. But at a time when the focus in thinking about the oil and gas industry was more on an incredible boom that was being experienced in production, especially in the Permian Basin and other formations relevant to Texas and the Gulf Coast more generally, that was driven by investments firms had made in hydraulic fracturing technologies and, sort of headlines where the US becoming the world's largest oil producer, which it hadn't been in many, many years, and so on. And so we started working on a question having to do with what the implications of that booming oil and gas production in the US, and particularly in Texas and Louisiana, would be for industrial emissions, right? This important sector, things like refineries, steel plants, cement plants, petrochemicals, and so on. And the idea was, hey, right, our eye has been on the ball of several things. One, right, fracking, encouraging lots of cheap gas, encouraging switches from coal to gas and electricity generation, the dramatic decline in costs of renewable electricity generation, which is also sort of helping with the energy transition. And we felt our eye had maybe gotten a little off the ball of this question of industrial sector emissions, which, while right, the fracking boom could create a decline in emissions in other sectors, it was going to be challenging to see how we could manage the sort of potential increase in industrial sector emissions driven by that boom. And so what we did is we studied the Gulf Coast region, and in doing so, we made some estimates of between 2015 and 2030, what the likely increase in emissions would be from all of this new production in the Permian Basin in particular. And we found, to our great surprise, that the emissions that were likely to be kind of causally attributed to that boom would be very significant. We found that they were equivalent to, on an annual basis, the emissions of about 130 coal-fired power plants. And so the second stage of that project was to think about solutions to that and what cost-effective mechanisms firms might have in the region and elsewhere to reduce those kinds of industrial sector emissions. And pretty quickly, once we went down that path, we found that, at least for the Gulf region, carbon capture was kind of it, relative to other technologies that are available to reduce industrial sector emissions. This was likely to be the cost-effective solution. And we were surprised that we hadn't kind of heard more, that economists and political scientists and other social scientists weren't talking more about this important set of technologies that seemed essential. And especially when you look at, the IEA or the IPCC or even US domestic or even state plans for reaching some of these ambitious decarbonization goals that have been set, carbon capture and storage for the industrial sector in particular plays a really important role in the modeling that has been done, that tells us what the paths might be to achieving those goals. So we saw this really important gap, and we wrote a grant proposal to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which is funding our current work, to try to answer a few what we thought were kind of pressing questions about why this technology wasn't being more widely adopted. Is it cost? Is it policy uncertainty or other constraints that firms face? And so that's what we're working on now.
Excellent. So one more question, maybe before we get into the meat of what you're learning. Can you give us, just sort of paint a visual picture for us about what does this look like? Like, you have these industrial facilities, and when you're talking about retrofitting with CC,
Yeah.
the carbon capture piece, what does that even look like? Are we talking about like big stacks that have to be built? Is it just
Yeah, that's a
fairly?
superb question. In fact, it's a building, right? It's a very large piece of technology. You're basically taking these flue gases from a facility like a refinery, and you're passing them through a chamber or a series of chambers that are exposing those gases to some solvents, some highly engineered, right, solvents that are, then generating two streams. One is a stream of flue gases without the carbon dioxide in it, and the other is ideally on the other end a pure stream of carbon dioxide. But depending on the industry and particular combustion processes that you're dealing with, sometimes it's not as involved a process, and at other times it's more expensive and requires more technology to get that pure stream of CO2 that can be either injected in deep underground formations or used for another process. And so that's the nature of it. It's a large, it sort of looks like a piece of equipment that you might see at a refinery with pipes and tanks and all kinds of stuff. It's multi-story. It's not a small piece of equipment that's required for this kind of a process.
And so, of course, that sounds expensive. And that kind of gets to the next question I had for you, which is the economics of CCUS. The margins are really not necessarily massive on a lot of the work that is emitting large amounts of greenhouse gases. And so the prospect of retrofitting greenhouse gas emitting facilities with, as you describe it, a big piece of infrastructure would seem to be somewhat challenging. So I wonder if you could tell us about what the economics of CCUS are like today.
Absolutely.
And then getting toward sort of, okay, so let's say we want to do this. How does this get paid for? Do we need federal regulation to say you must be doing? Is that sort of the?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you ended with that last question, because the answer to that last question is the sort of theme of my answer, which is that the first thing to know about the economics of carbon capture, utilization, and storage is that firms that emit CO2 when they produce things like gasoline through refining or steel, right, through some production process, do not have an incentive to adopt these carbon capture technologies, which are, as you said, expensive, in the absence of some kind of external incentive, like a price on carbon emissions. And that's very different from a lot of other important technologies in energy transition. So if you think about something like, renewable electricity generation, well, we're selling electrons, and, firms that are producing electrons really just want to do it as cheaply as possible. And so if the cost of generating electricity using wind or solar is cheaper than using gas or fossil fuels, then, and you have the infrastructure, right, the resources available to you to do that, well, we're going to see that come online. And so it's not surprising that even in the absence of comprehensive carbon pricing and carbon policy in the US, for example, we've seen this big transition in electricity generation over the past, decade or more toward renewables and away from fossil fuels. But that's very, very different, right? If I'm producing steel, refining gasoline, and those are my output goods, unless there's a market for captured CO2, right? Unless that's of economic value to me, another firm wants to pay me for it, for example, or the government creates an incentive. I'm either charged when I emit CO2, there's a price on carbon dioxide, or I get a subsidy, right, for a sort of bonus, a little carrot for capturing and storing those gases, then they generally are not going to do that. It doesn't make economic sense for them to do that. And so a price on carbon emissions is efficient, right? As an economist, I got to say that's good economic policy, because carbon dioxide causes economic damages versus, be its impact on climate change. And the most efficient approach to that would be some sort of carbon price. But at the national level in the United States, we don't have a carbon pricing regime. We do have some subnational regimes in California, which actually does apply to industrial facilities like those that we're studying in our project. And then the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, which only covers power plants and not industrial facilities. But in neither of those markets is the carbon price high enough to justify the cost of investing in carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So when Ben, Andrew, and I made those estimates that I discussed a few minutes ago for the Gulf Coast region, we had kind of average carbon capture and storage estimates of about $55 per ton. The range was something like $25 to $120, depending on the facility and what you assume about the discount rate and where you're storing it and whether firms cooperate in developing, CO2 pipeline infrastructure and so on. But so think about sort of $55 a ton, you know.
And just to clarify that, the $55 a ton is for just the capture piece or the
It's
capture?
actually mostly the capture piece. So about $48 of that was the capture piece. And then the remaining, you know, small amounts were for transport and for storage. So the capture piece, this big, you know, infrastructure with the solvents and the sort of industrial process that it takes to remove CO2 from those flue gases, that's the most expensive part. And the cost of that comes down and firms learn by doing. And obviously, again, we've seen, you know, big production cost declines for things like solar panels. And you could see a trend like that for CCUS. I don't know that anybody's predicting anything as dramatic as what we've seen for renewables over the past 10 years. But again, nobody predicted that either. So it's hard to say what the future would bring.
So if we can talk about the numbers for just a little bit more. Another number that we've run into recently is the price of CO2 for either, you know, food manufacturers or for cement production, you know, that high quality, high purity CO2, I think we've seen usually north of $100 per ton CO2. So that looks like a fairly good calculation. You know, if it costs $55 to capture it and sequester it, and you can sell it for 100, you're actually not losing money. Does that square, or what?
That is the
am I
way to
missing?
think about it. No, that is the way to think about it. So there are kind of two important caveats to my statement that, you know, firms don't have an incentive to invest in this technology without either a price or a carrot, right, or a subsidy. The first caveat is that some firms can cost effectively reuse CO2, either, you know, they can sell it to, you know, I mean, to think of really simple examples, right, a soda pop manufacturer, right, needs CO2 for its production process, and right, you've named some others. The biggest area in which we've seen this occurring is actually firms that are, you know, producing CO2 and then selling the CO2 or using it for, you know, internally within the firm for what's called enhanced oil recovery, right? So we see this a lot in the Gulf region. And again, this is something that's been happening since the 1970s. Firms have done this for a long time. Instead of using, you know, say fracking fluids to stimulate an old oil well, they can use CO2 and gas and other forms to do that. And then the CO2 does stay in the ground. So there is, right, a sort of discernible climate benefit to that, but it comes with a bit of an asterisk in the sense that, right, you're still producing oil, and the question is,
Right.
if that's additional, right, and wouldn't have been produced elsewhere to satisfy demand, right, then you might worry about those longer term impacts. And so there is this market for reuse. And in fact, a lot of the carbon capture that we see happening in Texas is for exactly that purpose, to reuse it to enhance oil recovery. So there is some of that. And we know that that is economic because firms have invested in CO2 pipeline infrastructure to do that, right? All of the kind of economic incentives are there that are just not there for just the storage piece, right? Sort of storage alone. So one question you might have is, well, if there are markets for this, you know, again, holding aside the asterisk on the potential downside of EOR, if there's markets for this in food production or elsewhere, why would the government need to step in? And my answer to that would be that my sense is that the scale at which we're producing carbon dioxide from industrial processes is much larger than the scale of demand for CO2 as an input to other industrial processes. And so while that could be an important part of the picture in some places to incentivize the deployment and scaling up of CCUS, my sense is that it's not going to be nearly enough to incentivize the capture of as much emissions as we're going to need to do to meet some of the ambitious climate change goals that we have.
And there have been some problems, right, with using enhanced oil recovery to finance carbon capture facilities, as in the Petronova facility in Texas, which captures CO2 from a coal-burning power plant. That facility opened in 2017, but then shut down again in 2020. Can you speak to that a bit?
So this is an important question. I think in a way, the Petronova plant is a great example. One contributor to the shutdown of that facility was that a cost-effective thing that Petronova was doing with the captured CO2 was selling it for EOR, using it for enhanced oil recovery. So once the price of oil plunged, right, partly due to the pandemic, the economics just don't look so good anymore, right, for the kind of capture part of what they're doing. And so again, the really important role that the public sector plays is partly because leaving that piece to the market, oh, we have to have this, you know, kind of useful kind of end purpose for the CO2 that's not storage, you're depending on that being a stable factor, right? And otherwise, we're just going to release the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so that's a really tough thing, right? If we're trying to hit a target, right, of emissions reductions to make sure we don't cross an important threshold for temperature increase, for example. It's hard to depend on those kinds of market forces.
And so are you saying that CCUS will only develop at a significant scale if there is some sort of state level or federal level policy to force the issue?
My sense from our research so far is that given the structure of the industry, given the sort of small nature of the external markets for this kind of captured CO2, that the role of public policy is going to be primary in this particular case, that we just won't see a ton of large-scale development without more incentives, either a carrot or a stick, right? The carrot being subsidies and the stick being some kind of a comprehensive carbon price.
Right. And, this is a little bit of a tangent, but one of the topics that I've been really interested in, because I think it seems to be quite similar to this one, is the development of sewers in medieval Europe. There's some really astounding statistics that the life expectancy in a European city was basically doubled in many places when in the late 1850s, 1860s were finally mandated and developed at scale. And just to think that society and the broader economy was living contentedly with lifespans that were half or less than what they could have been with these adoptions, is quite staggering.
Yeah.
And we're sort of in a similar place now where we're quite contentedly spewing this destructive gas into the atmosphere and thinking very little of it, but ignoring the huge cost to not addressing it and sort of quibbling over, a marginal additional price.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could reflect on that. Like, is that
it's such a nice comparison for a couple of reasons. One is that, if cities worldwide now are responsible for managing, waste flows like sanitation, right? Then why are they not responsible at some level for managing gaseous waste, right? This carbon dioxide that's being emitted in the atmosphere. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But I think one really key factor here that you want to think about is the scale of the benefits, right? The sort of spatial distribution of the benefits from reducing emissions of carbon dioxide versus the scale of the cost, right? Who bears the cost? And you sort of led with this question about who bears the cost of carbon capture. And the answer right now is the firms that construct carbon capture and utilization and storage facilities. Who gets the benefits of those? Not so much the firms, right, that construct these facilities and operate them. And even at the national level, right, if we reduce US emissions very substantially, we'll garner a good share of the benefits of that through reduced impacts of climate change, but not 100% of the benefits of that. And so that spillover, right, the spatial disconnect between the beneficiaries of the emissions reduction and the folks that bear the costs is one of the thorniest problems, right, to solve from an economic perspective in terms of climate change.
I mean, I wonder, continuing down on that thread, what do we do about that? What is the solution to that structural issue?
Yeah, such a good question. I think this is exactly what the delegates ran into, right, at COP26 and all the prior conferences of the parties. But I do think one really important point, and it's relevant to this conversation about CCUS, is that when we reduce carbon dioxide emissions or methane emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions, we can also, in some cases, reduce local and regional air pollutants that cause really important health damages, which are local, right? So things like particulate matter emissions or NOx and these kinds of things. So one of the projects that we have going on that Andrew Waxman is actually the lead author on, it looks at this question, right? If we had broader scale adoption of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, as opposed to something like a carbon tax or, sets of technology standards or other kinds of regulations like we might more typically see in the US context under the Clean Air Act, what would be the implications for local and regional air pollutants, right? Because that's obviously a huge concern of these communities, places in the Gulf Coast that have for a long time struggled with problems of differential exposure to pollution by race and by income. And those communities want to know, right? They may be opposed to CCUS. Again, it's another big piece of industrial equipment, right? Do we really need more of that here? And I think these are really good questions, but I think to the extent that we can link these climate change policies with benefits for local communities in terms of reductions in air pollution that creates problems with asthma and premature mortality and so on. That I think is an area where we can see some advance.
Great. I wonder if we could talk about different policy levers that might exist to actually stimulate adoption of CCUS. You've mentioned a couple, but I wonder if you could sort of break them down, make a list. So we have a federal tax on emissions. What does that look like? How would that work? And then what are some of the other primary levers that might be effective at promoting adoption?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the first you mentioned already is carbon pricing, right? All that does is it says, the firm, let's imagine that our $55 per ton average is the right number in terms of the cost of CCUS. And let's just say, right, all industrial facilities have that cost in the US. Well, if you had a carbon tax that was set at, $60 per ton, then all of a sudden it's more efficient, right? It's more cost effective for firms to adopt CCUS and pay that $55 cost than it is for them to pay the tax at $60 per ton. So that's basically the way that a carbon price would work as the kind of stick, right? As I mentioned, we don't have comprehensive carbon pricing in the US. And there are some places where it exists, but those prices in those markets are nowhere near $60 per ton. They could be someday, and they are in the European Union, right? And there are other places where carbon prices have reached that level. And we could ask, is that prompting more development of this technology?
Is it?
I don't have a good answer to that. I wish I did. So my answer is the EU prices, which are around like $90 a ton today, haven't been that high for that long. So they were half or less than that a year ago. And the recent increase is really notable, and it makes it a little bit politically vulnerable, but it's functioning the way a carbon price is supposed to function. And so one of those functions would be to prompt the adoption of technologies like CCUS. I think it's too soon to tell, but I would be surprised if the prices, went this high, stayed this high. Firms expected them to stay this high if we didn't see more such development in the EU. Mm-hmm. And then the second class, which is just politically much easier, are the carrots, right? So we have in the United States under Section 45Q of the Internal Revenue Code, a subsidy for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And it's pretty good. So it started out at $20 per ton in 2008. And then in 2018, I'm just going to emphasize that date. In 2018, when there was not a whole lot of bipartisan things happening in the US Congress, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 increased the CCUS incentive so that 4 years from now in 2026, it's scheduled to reach $50 per ton. So that's much higher than any existing carbon price in the US. And knowing the long time lag between when a facility is started and when it actually comes online, that 2026 subsidy of $50 per ton is quite relevant to today's decisions for firms that might be considering investing in CCUS. So it actually is quite a rich incentive. And again, you think about that average cost of $55 per ton, there's quite a lot of emissions that are already would cost less than $50 per ton to sequester in the Gulf region. And so one of the big questions we ask in our current research is, given that there's this expectation of an increasing incentive in the United States, and given our estimates of cost, why don't we see more, carbon capture happening in the Gulf region?
And do you have any theories right now about why we aren't seeing this happen?
So we have a couple of thoughts on that. So our first is, hey, our cost estimates could be wrong, right? We're a bunch of academics. We're not running these plants. We have run them by some folks. We've compared them to other cost estimates in literature, and they seem in the ballpark. So it's always possible, right, that our average estimate of $55 per ton for the region is wrong. But we have a couple of other thoughts too, which really prompted this proposal for the current work. One is policy uncertainty, right? So if you're a firm and you're making an investment in this big piece of capital equipment that's going to also be fairly expensive to operate on an ongoing basis, and it's entirely driven by the Section 45Q of the Internal Revenue Code that says you get paid $50 per ton starting in 2026. This year, I think the subsidy is between $35 and $40 per ton. So it's on a sort of ramping up trajectory. You need to know that first you qualify, right? There have to be some good guidelines for, how to apply and whether everything that I'm doing makes it so that I can get that payment. And two, you got to know that it's going to stick around for 20 years or more, right? This facility is going to be around for a long time. So there's this long-lived capital investment problem. And just give you one example, even though that new, richer set of incentives was passed by the Congress in 2018, it wasn't until January 2021 that the Treasury Department issued guidance to firms on what exactly qualified, what's the timeline, and so on. So that's a really long lag, right? And if they had done it right away, maybe we would already see some development. So policy uncertainty is really important. Another piece of the puzzle, we think, is kind of positive spillovers from investment. So that is, if I'm a firm and I think it's worth it for me to build out a CO2 pipeline network in addition to my storage facility, other firms can benefit from that CO2 pipeline network. And so the fact that my investment sort of spills over in positive ways to other firms, some of whom might be my competitors, can be a mild disincentive. And so that could also be another barrier, right? Could explain some slow development of this kind of process.
Mm-hmm. And so a final question for you. We've talked a lot so far about cost and potential in the Gulf region of the US, But what is the potential for deployment of CCUS outside of the United States?
I think what you're looking for, if you want to think about a location where you're likely to see large-scale deployment of CCS, would be a couple of things. One would be, what are the incentives, right? So for a market economy, there has to be some, sort of policy lever to supplement that somewhat smaller market for using CO2 in other applications. And there has to be this is just on the industrial side, so power plants are a little bit different, but a fairly large agglomeration of facilities in one place to kind of make this regional investment in the technologies that are required to make economic sense.
Right.
So I think that we're likely to see it in places like the Gulf region in the US, right, or other places around the world where we see these big agglomerations of industrial facilities that have few cheaper options, right, if any cheaper options for reducing carbon dioxide, but have to do so because they're being required to do so by a policy lever of some kind. And then that important aside is that natural gas combined cycle power plants are also amenable to retrofitting with CCUS or being built right from the ground up with CCUS technologies. And my sense is that, that $50 per ton in 2026 gets pretty close to being a fairly appealing thing for those types of power plants. And so that would be a much more sort of diffuse, right, set of applications where it's specific to an individual plant. Again, they still need to be someplace where that carbon can either be stored safely, right, or close to a pipeline network that can be used to move it to an alternative use. And so that, my sense, will be the constraint, right? So you need policy levers, you need agglomerations of facilities and/or natural gas power plants that are amenable for retrofitting, and you need access to abundant storage facilities. And,
right.
and those kind of sweet spot places may not be everywhere, but certainly we see carbon capture facilities in places like Norway and Iceland, right, in addition to places like the Gulf Coast.
That's it for this episode of the podcast. To learn more about carbon capture, utilization, and storage, check out our interviews with Dr. Howard Herzog and Dr. Julio Friedman at climatenow.com. There you can also find 2 videos on carbon capture that dive into the costs and potential CO2 storage capacity of these technologies. And if you would like to get in touch with us, email us at contact@climatenow.com or tweet us at WeAreClimateNow. We hope you'll join us for our next conversation.